She was branded a witch over a death she fought all night to prevent, bound in wet rope and dragged toward a dawn drowning by the very town she had healed. But when a condemned frontier healer is cut loose in the freezing dark by the territory's most feared mountain man, her steady hands and one impossible shot will tear the truth out of the man who framed her and set the whole snowbound gulch ablaze. It was the bitter March of 1873, and the wind that came howling down off the divide carried the smell of wood smoke, river ice, and silver dust into the rough little camp of Cinnabar Gulch, Montana Territory. The town was a single, crooked street pinned between two black walls of mountain, a place built fast and ugly on the promise of ore, where the assay office stood prouder than the church, and a man's worth was weighed in the grains his rock gave up. Into that hard country, 4 winters past, had come Tessa Brennan, 24 years old, an orphan parson's daughter who had learned medicine at her dead mother's elbow and at the side of an army surgeon who had taken pity on a clever girl with quick fingers. She had no kin left living and no place that wanted her until Cinnabar Gulch found that it did. She set bones the camp doctor was too drunk to set. She pulled fevers down with willow bark and cold cloths. She caught the babies that came screaming into that thin mountain air at 2 in the morning, and she asked little in return beyond a meal and the right to be let alone. The miners' wives called her a blessing. The miners themselves, hard men who trusted nothing they could not hold, came to trust her hands. And the assayer, a smiling, well-fed man named Cornelius Pruitt, who wore a clean collar in a town of mud, watched Tessa Brennan with a careful, measuring patience that she had been too busy and too tired to read for the danger it was. For Pruitt had a secret buried under his polished manner, and that winter the secret had begun to bleed. A claim called the Widow's Hope, worked by a stubborn old prospector named Asa Cole, had come up rich, and Pruitt had filed papers that quietly seized it on a debt that did not exist, salting his own assay reports and poisoning the spring that fed the old man's diggings so the strike would read as worthless to everyone but himself. Asa Cole had taken sick from his own water and had gone to his grave coughing black, and the only living soul who knew the water was tainted was Pruitt himself. Then Pruitt's wife, a pale and gentle woman named Lavinia, had begun to sicken in just the same way, for she had drunk from a jug carried down from that poisoned spring, and Pruitt, terrified that a doctor's eye might name the thing in her blood, had let it run rather than risk the truth. When Lavinia's fever turned, it was Tessa they sent for in the dead of night, and Tessa, who fought for her across 2 days and a night with everything she knew, and Tessa, who held the woman's hand at the gray hour when her breath finally stopped. And it was Cornelius Pruitt, standing in his doorway with a face arranged into grief, who turned to the gathered neighbors and said, in a voice that carried, she brewed her teas and her poultices, and my Lavinia took worse with every cup. I've heard how she mutters over the sick. I say there's witchcraft in this house, and that woman is the cause. It was a monstrous thing to say, and a clever one, for fear travels faster than reason in a town shut in by snow, and a hungry, frightened, isolated camp is a dry field waiting for a spark. By the next morning, the whispers had hardened. Mrs. Hartley, whose own child Tessa had pulled through scarlet fever, would not meet her eyes. The barkeep, a brutal slab of a man called Boone, who served as Pruitt's muscle, came with 3 others to the lean to where Tessa kept her cot and her herbs, and he did not knock. They tore her medicines off the shelf and ground the jars under their heels, and when she stood her ground and said, "I did everything in my power to save Lavinia Pruitt, and I will not be slandered in the house I tried to save her in," Boone struck her across the mouth so the words ended in blood. They held a sham of a trial in the saloon that same afternoon, with Pruitt as accuser and judge both, and a frightened crowd that wanted, more than anything, a reason that was not their own helplessness. Pruitt stood before them in his clean collar with his soft hands folded, and he spun his lie into a sermon. He spoke of the strange herbs he claimed to have found in his wife's room, of the muttering he swore he'd heard through the door, of how Lavinia had been hale and rosy until this woman's tease had touched her lips. He held up a withered root from Tessa's own stores and turned it in the lamplight like a thing dredged from a grave. And the crowd shrank from it, though it was nothing but dried valerian for a sleepless woman's nerves. When Tessa rose to answer him, to say that she had sat awake 2 nights running for his wife and wept when the breath left her, Boone's heavy hand pressed her back down into her chair, and Pruitt only smiled and said that the guilty always protest the loudest. No one spoke for her. The army surgeon who might have was 300 miles south. The camp doctor was face down drunk. When Pruitt pronounced the sentence, he wrapped his cruelty in the language of mercy, the way such men always do. "We'll not hang a woman in Cinnabar Gulch," he said, spreading his soft hands. "We're Christian men. At first light, she'll be put into the river bottoms, bound. And the water will decide what she is. If she's innocent, the Lord will spare her. If she's what I say she is, the cold will take her back where she came from." It was a death sentence dressed as a prayer, and every man in that room knew it, and not one of them said a word against it. They bound her wrists with rope soaked in the trough so the knots would swell tight. And they marched her out before dawn into a world turning blue-white with new snow, down the steep track to where the Cinnabar River ran black and half-frozen between its drifts. A late blizzard was coming in off the high country, and Tessa Brennan walked into the teeth of it with her hands tied and her lips split, 24 years old, condemned by the only people who had ever needed her. They did not even stay to watch. They left her bound to a leaning cottonwood at the river's edge, the cold already a living weight against her chest, and they climbed back up the track to their fires, and they told themselves that whatever happened now was God's doing and not theirs. The blizzard closed over the gulch like a lid. The light went gray, then grayer, then went out of the world altogether, and there was only the wind and the killing cold and the slow, sweet, terrible warmth that comes at the end of freezing, the warmth that is the body giving up. Tessa worked the swollen ropes until her wrists ran raw and bloody, and still they would not give. She prayed, and then she could not feel her lips to pray. Her knees buckled, and the snow rose up to take her, soft as a feather bed, and her eyes were closing on the white silence when she caught it on the wind, faint and impossible wood smoke. And then a shape came out of the storm. It came low and silent and huge, more shadow than man, broad through the shoulders and wrapped in furs and snow until it seemed a thing the mountain itself had sent down. And Tessa Brennan, with the last clear thought she would have for a long while, was certain that the cold had finally given her the death she'd been promised. The shape crouched over her. She felt the bite of a blade and thought distantly that at least it would be quicker than the river. But the knife went to the rope and not to her throat, and the ropes fell away, and a pair of arms hard as cordwood lifted her clear of the snow as though she weighed nothing at all. She woke to warmth and the smell of pine resin and rendered fat and the low red light of a fire. She was lying on a pallet of hides in a cabin built tight as a fist, every chink daubed, the single room hung with traps and pelts and dried meat and the long blue shapes of rifles. A man sat across the fire from her, watching her over the barrel of one of those rifles, and he was the most frightening thing she had ever seen and the only warm thing in 100 miles. He was perhaps 35, though the weather had made him older, with a beard gone wild and dark hair shot with early gray, and down the left side of his face ran an old cavalry saber scar that pulled his cheek into a permanent grimness. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of river ice over deep water, and they did not blink. Tessa had heard the camp speak of him in the way men speak of weather and wolves. They called him Ghost Wolf, and they swore he had killed men and eaten his own dogs and gone mad alone up in the high cabins, and they crossed the street rather than pass him when the rare times he came down for powder and salt. His name, though the Gulch had half forgotten it, was Eli Vance. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and rusted from disuse. The words clipped and dropped at the edges. "Reckon you'll want to know why you ain't dead. Truth is, I half wish I'd left you. A man stays out of other folks' troubles, he lives longer." Tessa pushed herself up against the cabin wall, and though her every joint screamed and her hands were swollen to claws, she met his pale eyes without flinching. "Then why didn't you?" she asked, and her voice came out hoarse but even, the formal, schooled cadence of a parson's daughter. "Why cut a condemned woman loose, if you wanted no part of the trouble that condemned her?" Something flickered behind that frozen stare. "Because a man doesn't leave a body to freeze in a drift like a dropped glove," he said. "Not a dog and not a woman, whatever you done." "I did nothing," Tessa said. "A woman died in my care, and the man who feared what I might find called me a witch, and a frightened town believed him because believing him was easier than facing the cold alone." Eli Vance studied her a long moment, and slowly, the rifle came down off her. "Pruitt," he said, and a single word was an accusation and a confirmation both. And for the first time Tessa understood that this terrible silent man knew something she did not. He gave her broth and did not ask her name, and she did not give it, and they passed the first day in a watchful, wordless truce while the blizzard screamed itself out against the cabin walls. But on the second morning Tessa saw what the firelight had hidden the night before. Eli moved like a man nursing a wound, and when he stripped off his fur to feed the fire, she saw the dark stain seeping through the side of his Henley, low in the ribs, and the bad gray color creeping up from it under his skin. "You're hurt," she said, and it was not a question, and the healer in her was already on her feet before the fear could stop her. "That's a wound gone septic. If you don't let me open it and clean it, the rot will reach your blood, and no town and no God will save you. Sit down by the light." He looked at her hands, raw and swollen as they were, and at her face, and at the thing in her eyes that even 4 winters of Cinnabar Gulch had not been able to burn out of her. And after a long moment the most feared man in the territory sat down and let the witch they'd condemned put her hands on him. She found the camp's mark in his flesh. A deep knife track 3 weeks old, gone the color of a thundercloud, and she boiled her needle and threaded it with catgut from his own kit, and she cut into the poison and drained it and packed the wound with the few herbs she'd had sewn into her hem. And through all of it he sat carved from granite and made no sound but a single sharp breath when the blade went deep. "Where did you come by this?" she asked, working, It's a wound a man gets fighting, and you've no neighbors to fight." Eli was quiet so long she thought he would not answer. Then, watching the fire, he began to talk, and the words came out of him slow and rusty like water finding an old channel. "Was a deputy marshal once," he said, "down in Kansas after the war. Saw enough killing in the war to last 10 men, and then I went and pinned on a star and saw more. There was a town there, a good little town, and a woman in it I meant to marry come spring. Her name was Ruth. One night a band of bordermen rode in to settle an old grudge with the man I was sworn to guard, and I was a quarter-mile off when the shooting started. And by the time I got there it was finished, and Ruth had stepped into the street to pull a child clear and caught a stray ball doing it. She died with that child safe in her arms and me holding her in the mud, and I learned that night that a man can be fast and brave and sworn to the law, and it still won't be enough to save the one thing he can't live without. After that the badge felt like a lie and the town felt like a grave, and every kind face that looked at me looked like it was waiting on me to fail it the same way. So I gave back the star and I came up here, where the only life I could lose was my own, and the only soul I could fail was a man who deserved no better." He drew a breath. 3 weeks back I was checking my high traps, and I came down on the Widow's Hope, old Asa Cole's diggings, and I saw a thing I wasn't meant to see. I saw Cornelius Pruitt and that ape Boone dumping something foul in the springhead above Asa's claim, killing the water so the strike would read poor and Pruitt could seize it cheap. Boone spotted me and we tangled, and he put this knife in my side before I broke loose. That's why I cut you down, quicker than I'd have cut down most, because I heard them say the witch killed Pruitt's wife. And I'd already watched Pruitt poison a man's water. A man who'd murder a claim that way wouldn't blink at murdering a wife who got curious and laying it on the one set of hands clean enough to take the blame. The fire popped in the silence. Tessa's own hands went still on the bandage. Lavinia Pruitt died with the same black cough as Asa Cole, she said slowly. And the whole horror of it opened up in front of her like a crevasse. She drank from that spring. I smelled something wrong in her, something I'd no name for, and I thought it was the fever. He poisoned his own wife, or let the poison run in her so a doctor couldn't be called, and then he hanged the suspicion on me to bury both crimes in one grave. She looked up at the scarred man across the fire. "You knew. You've known since the night you cut me loose. Why didn't you say so?" "Because a feared man up a mountain saying a respectable man down in town's a murderer is a feared man they hang next," Eli said grimly. "I got no proof but my own 2 eyes, and out here that's worth less than nothing. But you—" He stopped and looked at her differently then. The way a man looks at a tool he hadn't known he was holding. "You were there when she died. You can name the poison. That's the one thing in this world Pruitt can't have walking around alive." And there it was, laid bare between them in the firelight, at the heart of the long dark, not a rescue, but a reckoning. 2 condemned people who between them held the whole truth that one rich. Smiling murderer needed dead and buried under the snow. The blizzard blew itself out in the night, and dawn came hard and bright and blue. The sky scrubbed clean, the drifts piled to the cabin eaves and glittering like crushed glass. For 3 days the pass stayed choked with snow, and in those 3 days something thawed in the tight little cabin that the cold could not freeze. Tessa cooked over his fire and found the rhythm of the small place, and Eli mended traps and split wood and tended the wound she dressed twice a day. And they talked, carefully at first and then less carefully, in the long blue evenings when the wind sang in the stovepipe. She told him of her mother's still room and the herbs hung to dry from the rafters of her childhood, of the army surgeon who had let a stubborn girl watch him work and then taught her because she would not stop asking, of the 4 winters in Cinnabar Gulch when she had belonged to a town only so long as it needed mending. He told her, haltingly, of the war and the years after, of the silence of the high country that he had once thought was peace and had lately come to know was only loneliness wearing a quieter coat. She found beneath the granite a man who had buried his decency rather than watch it fail again, and he found, beneath the schooled, formal calm, a woman with a spine of cold iron and a heart she had never once let the world harden, no matter how hard the world had tried. He taught her to load and level the long Colt revolver he kept, his rough hand closing over hers on the grip. 2 hands. Lock your wrists, or it'll buck and throw your shot wide, he told her. Don't aim for a man's heart. Aim for the middle of him, the part that don't move. And don't you pull till you mean it, because once you mean it, there's no calling it back. She was a better student than he expected, steady-eyed and unflinching, and he told her so, and she felt a warmth at the praise that had nothing to do with the fire. On the 3rd night, when she changed the dressing on his side and found the wound clean and pink and healing, he caught her wrist as she finished, and for a moment the whole cabin held its breath. He did not pull her to him. He only pressed her bandaged hand flat against his chest, where his heart beat slow and hard, and he said, low and rough, I've lived 5 years up here so as never to be the cause of another soul's grief. But they'll come for you, soon as the past clears. And I want you to hear me say this so there's no mistake in it. You are under my protection now, Tessa Brainin. They'll have to come through me to lay a hand on you, and a great many of them won't be going home. It was the closest thing to a vow she had ever been given, and she answered it not with a kiss, but by leaning her forehead against his, there in the red light, 2 scarred and solitary people finding in the worst hour of both their lives the one thing neither had dared to want. The past cleared on the 4th day, and with it came the torches. Eli was on the cabin roof patching a seam when he went still and shaded his eyes against the glare off the snow, and Tessa, following his gaze down the long white throat of the valley, saw it. A line of dark figures climbing the track, a dozen, then 20, then more, and the hard glint of rifle barrels. And at their head, a man on a fine bay horse who could only be Cornelius Pruitt. Word had reached the gulch that Ghost Wolf had taken the witch in, and Pruitt had not come to argue Scripture. He had come to finish what the river hadn't, to put both witnesses under the snow before the spring thaw could carry the truth downstream. How many shells have we? Tessa asked, and her voice did not shake. Eli looked at her, and there was something like fierce pride in his ruined face. Not enough of that many, he said. But we're not staying to be counted. There's an old digging up the ridge, the Lucky Strike, played out 20 years back with one way in and a wall of rock at your back. We make for that. Now, they went out the back into the blinding cold with what they could carry. 2 rifles and the Colt and a sack of shells and powder, and they ran the high traverse with the mob's shouts ringing off the canyon walls behind them, and Pruitt's men came on like a pack of wolves that had finally cornered the thing they feared. The snow was hip-deep in the drifts, and the going was murder, and twice Tessa went down, and twice Eli hauled her up by the collar without breaking stride. And behind them the line of men spread out across the white slope like spilled ink. The first shots cracked and whined off the rocks, kicking up little fountains of snow at their heels. Eli shoved her into the lee of a granite shoulder and turned at the tree line and dropped 2 of the lead men with 2 shots, cool and unhurried as a man swatting flies at a Sunday table, and the rest flung themselves flat in the snow, and that bought the seconds they needed. They scrambled the last steep pitch with lead snapping the air around them, and gained the dark mouth of the Lucky Strike just as a volley raked the rock where they had stood. Inside, the old mine was a single black gut of a tunnel driven 30 feet into the mountain's heart, timbered and sagging, and across its throat lay a tumble of fallen rock that made a fair breastwork. There Eli laid out the shells, and there they made their stand. The men came at the mine mouth in a rush, and the narrow stone funnel turned against them, for only 2 or 3 could come abreast, and Eli's rifle did not miss. But there were too many, and they had powder of their own, and Boone, that brutal slab of a man, crawled up under cover of his fellow's fire and flung a charge of blasting powder that went off against the timbers with a roar that brought half the roof down in a choking avalanche of dust and stone. When it cleared, Eli was down. A falling balk had caught him across the back, and a ball had taken him through the meat of his shoulder, and he lay pinned and bleeding in the rubble, his rifle crushed beneath the fallen timber, the long Colt knocked from his hand and skidded across the stone. And through the settling dust came Cornelius Pruitt, picking his clean-collared way over the broken rock, with Boone at his back and a hunting knife in his soft hand, smiling the smile that had ruled a town. "Well now," Pruitt said, looking down at the pinned mountain man, "the fearsome ghost wolf run to ground in a hole in the ground. How fitting!" He crouched and laid the bright edge of the blade against Eli's throat, almost tender. "You should have stayed up your mountain, trapper. You saw a thing you weren't meant to see, and you took in a woman you weren't meant to take in, and now I'm going to open you up, and then her, and the snow will swallow the both of you, and there's not a soul in this territory who will ask a single question. They'll thank me for it." He pressed the knife down, and a thin line of red welled up against the steel. And in the smoke and ruin behind him, forgotten, beneath her, lay the long Colt revolver where it had slid. Tessa Brennan reached it through the dust. Every instinct of 4 winters spent saving lives screamed against what her hands were about to do, but she thought of Lavinia gasping out her last in a poisoned bed, and of old Asa Cole coughing black into the snow, and of her own wrists raw and bleeding against a cottonwood at the river's edge while a whole town climbed back to its fires, and the screaming went quiet. Her raw hands closed around the grip the way Eli had taught her, both hands, wrists locked, and she came up out of the rubble onto her knees, and she did not aim for the heart that moves, but for the middle of the man that does not. Boone saw her and lunged, and she swung the barrel and fired, and he went down across the rocks and did not rise. The shot rang in the stone tunnel like the crack of the world breaking. Pruitt whirled from Eli's throat, the knife coming up, his smiling face going slack with the first true fear he had ever known, and he found himself looking down the barrel of a gun held rock steady in the hands of the woman he had condemned to drown. "You're a witch," he hissed, scrabbling backward over the stone. "You're a witch, and no one will take the word of I am a healer," Tessa said. And her voice did not waver, and her eyes were the gray of cold iron. "I tried to save your wife, and you poisoned her and Asa Cole, and you would have let a whole town watch me drown to keep it buried. You called the storm down on me, Cornelius Pruitt. Now stand in it." He lunged for her with the knife. She pulled the trigger. The Colt bucked against her locked wrists, and the heavy ball took Cornelius Pruitt low through the body and dropped him broken against the rock he'd meant to bury her under, his fine, clean collar going dark, the knife clattering from his hand into the dust. He did not die there. The frontier and the law would see to him slower and surer than that. For even as the echo faded, there was shouting at the mine mouth, and the press of Pruitt's men broke and scattered, and into the dust strode a lean, hard-eyed man with a tin star on his coat and a federal warrant in his fist, U.S. Marshal Calder, ridden up 3 weeks late on the trail of a string of salted assay reports and stolen claims that had reached all the way to the territorial capital. He had the forged papers in his saddlebag, the false filings on the widow's hope, the doctored reports in Pruitt's own clean hand, and now he had a poisoned wife and a poisoned prospector and the steady, unbroken testimony of a healer who could name the thing in their blood. Pruitt was hauled from the rubble in irons, gray-faced and gut-shot but living long enough to hang. And Tessa Brennan, who had walked into that valley 4 winters past with nothing, and had walked out of the gulch in ropes to drown, knelt instead in the broken dark and pressed her hands to the bleeding shoulder of the man who had cut her loose, and went to work saving the life that had saved hers. The long winter broke at last. The snow that had buried the gulch ran off the high country in singing freshets, and the black walls of the mountains went green at their feet, and the Cinnabar River that had been meant to be her grave ran bright and loud and full of spring. Cornelius Pruitt was taken down to the territorial seat in chains and tried before a real judge and a real jury. With the marshal's papers and Tessa's testimony to damn him, and he was hanged for the murder of his wife and Asa Cole, and the theft of the widow's hope, and the camp that had so eagerly called Tessa a witch found it could not meet her eyes when she came back down the track. But she did not come back to live among them. She came down only to stand witness, and to set the record of her name straight in the county book, and then she climbed the track once more to the tight little cabin up the ridge, which was no longer tight nor little, for Eli Vance had spent the thaw adding a second room and a wide window that looked east over the whole green sweep of the valley. Working one armed at first, while his shoulder healed under her care, and then with both. They were married in May beneath an open Montana sky by a circuit preacher who had heard the whole true story and was honored to do it, with no town and no crowd, only the marshal who had come back to stand up for the groom, and the high blue arch of the heavens, and the wind off the divide carrying the smell of new grass and pine. The widow's hope, restored by the court to old Asa Cole's distant nephew, paid out honest at last, and a portion of the law's reward for breaking the claim fraud ring came to the two who had broken it, enough to keep the cabin warm and the larder full for all their days. The healer who had been thrown away set up her practice in earnest then, and the high cabin became a place where a sick child or a laboring mother or a man with a wound gone bad could come and find clean hands and a warm fire and no questions asked, and the feared ghost wolf who had gone up the mountain to be the cause of no one's grief came down from it at last to be the cause of one woman's joy, and was seen to smile, which no one in Cinnabar Gulch would ever have believed. On the porch of the cabin, in the last gold light of a spring evening, Eli pulled her against his chest and pressed his rough cheek to her hair, and Tessa Brennan, who had been bound and slandered and marched out to drown, looked out over the green and shining valley that had tried to kill her, and knew that she had not merely survived the frontier, she had conquered it. What a breathtaking tale of survival, betrayal, and untamed frontier love. Tessa and Eli proved that even in the cruelest, coldest corner of the wilderness, A clean heart and a steady hand can drag the truth into the light and turn the storm back on the man who called it down. Did you love this Wild West romance? Hit that like button, share this gripping story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical sagas. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Tessa's shoes, bound at the river's edge with the cold closing in and only your own two hands to save you? Hi, my name is Inslee Rowland, the owner and manager of Frontier Encounters, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with Tessa and Eli all the way to the spring. I keep coming back to that moment in the broken dark of the mine, when a woman everyone had thrown away picked up the gun and refused to be useless 1 second longer, because I think there's a kind of courage that only shows itself after the world has done its worst, and Tessa had it in her all along. So, before you go, I'd truly love to hear from you. Do you believe Eli saw the strength in her from the very first night by the fire? Or do you think she earned his trust slowly, one quiet act of mercy at a time? And tell me this, if a whole town had turned its back on you the way Cinnabar Gulch turned its back on her, could you have found it in your heart to come back down that mountain and heal them anyway?